The room froze. The billionaire's confident smirk faded, his hand still half raised in mockery. Across from him, the young hotel maid stood tall, her eyes calm but unyielding. "You think I didn't understand you, Señor Laurel," she said softly, her Spanish smooth and precise. "But I did. Every single word." For a moment, even the air stopped moving. The laughter from the table behind him died into disbelief. The woman seated nearby, his business associate, watched wide-eyed as the once untouchable tycoon blinked, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. In that instant, the entire power in the room shifted. The maid he had mocked was no longer invisible. She was seen. But this moment, the one caught forever in that look of shock, didn't begin here. It began hours earlier, with a woman named Patricia Jennings. Pushing her cleaning cart through the marble halls of the Azure Palace Hotel, trying to survive another ordinary day. She had no idea that before the sun set, her quiet courage would humble a billionaire and change both their lives forever. Welcome back to Powder Room Tales. If you're new here, hit subscribe and join our growing family. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? Washington? New York? London? Wherever you are, may peace and favor follow you today. Your support means the world to us. It helps more people see and share in these amazing stories. Now, let's dive into today's story. The morning light streamed through the tall glass windows of the Azure Palace Hotel, scattering gold across polished marble floors. Guests came and went in waves of perfume, designer suits, and self-importance. But amid all that luxury, one woman's presence went largely unnoticed. Patricia Jennings, 28, moved quietly between the suites. Measured, efficient, graceful. Her black and white uniform was neatly pressed, her hair pinned back with precision. She worked like someone who had long accepted that being invisible was part of the job. Every morning began the same way. Check her supplies, whisper a prayer for strength, and pray her mother's medication would last another week. Her world was built on schedules, not dreams. But even so, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who refused to break. That afternoon, she received her assignment. Suite 1701, VIP guest, handle with care. She nodded quietly, pushing her cart toward the private elevator. The higher she went, the quieter the hotel became. By the time she reached the penthouse, the only sound was her own heartbeat. She knocked softly. No answer. Assuming the guest was out, she slipped inside, careful not to disturb the order of things. The suite was magnificent. Glass walls, golden light, soft music. She moved like a shadow, adjusting curtains, polishing glassware. Then she heard it. A man's voice. Smooth, commanding, confident. Sí, amigo, he said, laughing into his phone. Estoy en el hotel ahora. Muy elegante, pero lleno de empleados que piensan que el uniforme los hace importantes. Yes, my friend. I'm at the hotel now. Very elegant, but full of employees who think their uniforms make them important. He chuckled again, glancing lazily toward her reflection in the glass. Mírala, la sirvienta, tan seria, como si fuera dueña del lugar. Look at her, the maid, so serious, as if she owns the place. Patricia froze. Pobrecita, he added, voice dripping with arrogance. Seguramente piensa que trabajar aquí es un sueño. No sabe que solo limpia los sueños de los demás. Poor thing. She probably thinks working here is a dream. She doesn't realize she's just cleaning up other people's dreams. The laughter from the phone grew louder. He wasn't whispering. He wanted her to hear. Las manos temblorosas lo dicen todo, ¿no? No está acostumbrada a tocar cosas finas. Those trembling hands say it all, don't they? She's not used to touching fine things. The words struck like a knife. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling, not from shame, but from something older, deeper, burning quietly inside her chest. He didn't know she understood. He didn't know that every cruel syllable was being translated in her mind. She took a breath, then another. And when she finally turned to face him, her fear had turned into calm fire. "Sabe, Señor Laurel," she began softly, her voice steady, every word like a blade wrapped in silk. "Do you know something, Mr. Laurel?" He blinked, startled. "Las manos que usted llama temblorosas son las mismas que limpian el suelo donde usted camina con orgullo. The hands you call trembling are the same ones that clean the floor where you walk so proudly." He frowned, shifting slightly in his seat. "Y ese uniforme que usted desprecia, lo llevo con dignidad, porque el trabajo no roba el valor de nadie, solo revela quién realmente lo tiene. And that uniform you mock, I wear it with dignity, because work doesn't take away a person's worth. It reveals who truly has it." He set his glass down slowly. The sound of crystal against marble rang louder than the laughter on the other end of the phone. "Usted habla de sueños," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "Dice que limpio los sueños de los demás. Pero al menos yo no he olvidado los míos. You speak of dreams. You say I clean up other people's dreams. But at least I haven't forgotten mine." Her voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "La verdadera pobreza no es no tener dinero, Señor Laurel. Es no tener respeto. True poverty isn't the lack of money, Mr. Laurel. It's the lack of respect." He stared at her, speechless. "Y el idioma que usted usa para burlarse," she said finally, her tone soft but cutting, "es el mismo idioma que yo aprendí para conectar con las personas, no para pisarlas. And the language you use to mock others is the same language I once learned to connect with people, not to trample them." The room fell silent. Even the man on the other end of the phone stopped speaking. James's smirk dissolved into uncertainty. Patricia lowered her eyes briefly, not out of submission, but completion. Then, switching back to English, she said gently, "Enjoy your afternoon, sir." And with quiet grace, she turned and left the suite, her dignity intact, her silence broken, and her worth undeniable. Have you ever been underestimated, only to find the courage to speak the truth anyway? Some people never find their voice until it's too late. Don't be one of them. Subscribe now before you scroll away, because the next chapter will show you how one act of courage can humble power itself. From the glass walls of the Azure Palace Hotel's top floor, the city shimmered like a possession. Towers, cars, people, all moving beneath him, small, distant, obedient. It was exactly how James Laurel liked it. For 20 years he had built his life on control, the kind of power that turned hesitation into weakness and apology into failure. But that morning, something had shifted. He still wore the same suit, still spoke with the same confidence, but inside, something small and unfamiliar had begun to rattle the walls he'd built around himself. A voice. Her voice. La verdadera pobreza no es no tener dinero, Señor Laurel. Es no tener respeto. True poverty isn't the lack of money, Mr. Laurel. It's the lack of respect. The words played on repeat, echoing in his head like a melody he couldn't forget. He told himself it didn't matter, that she was just a maid, that her words carried no weight. But every time he replayed the scene, the image of her eyes, calm, steady, unflinching, cracked that illusion a little more. He had mocked her for trembling hands, but now it was he who wouldn't stay still. That morning, James sat in the hotel lounge nursing a black coffee gone cold. His phone buzzed constantly. Investors, lawyers, assistants, but he ignored every call. The previous day's arrogance had left a stain he couldn't wash off, not because of what she'd said, but because of what it revealed about him. He had spent years convincing himself that he respected hard-worked into him. His public speeches were full of it. Every success starts with service. We rise together. But in private, he'd built a world where only the loud were heard, and only the wealthy mattered. When he thought of Patricia's words, he realized that for all his wealth, she was the one who carried the greater fortune. Self-respect. By noon, he tried distracting himself with meetings. He walked into the executive lounge, surrounded by his board members. All men dressed like him, all fluent in money, none fluent in humility. "James," one of them, Adrian, grinned. "Heard you had an incident with one of the maids yesterday. Did she break something expensive?" The others laughed. James didn't. He leaned back, studying their faces, men he'd built his empire with, men who had learned to laugh only when he did. And suddenly, the sound of their laughter felt hollow. "No," he said quietly. "She didn't break anything. She just reminded me that we have." The laughter died instantly. Adrian frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" James gave a faint, humorless smile. "It means we've built a world that serves us, but somewhere along the way, we forgot how to serve anyone else." A tense silence followed. It was the first time they had heard him speak like that, not as their confident leader, but as a man unsure of who he had become. Later that evening, back in his suite, James poured himself another drink, though this time it wasn't out of arrogance, it was avoidance. He stood by the window, watching the lights of the city flicker like memories. He tried to tell himself he'd done nothing wrong, that the maid had overreacted, that it was just a misunderstanding. But the more he tried to justify it, the smaller he felt. Because deep down, he knew. He hadn't mocked a maid that day. He'd mocked himself, the man he used to be before wealth taught him pride. He remembered his mother's voice, warm, worn, wise. "Jimmy, if you ever forget how to speak kindly to the people who serve you, you don't deserve to be served." He hadn't thought of her words in years, but now they hurt. He looked around the penthouse, gold, glass, perfection, and felt the strange sting of loneliness. All this, and not one thing that made him better. That night, James opened his laptop and began typing an email he'd never thought he'd write. Subject: Internal Audit, Employee Welfare and Recognition. Starting immediately, I want reports on staff treatment, promotion systems, and education programs in all Laurel properties, and I've spent years improving our hotels. Now it's time to improve the people who make them possible. He stared at the message for a long while before hitting send. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was the first step. When he finally turned off the lights, he whispered to the empty room, "Respect doesn't need wealth. It needs courage." And for the first time in a long time, he felt small, but in the right way. Have you ever realized too late that the person you looked down on was actually the mirror you needed to see yourself clearly? Arrogance doesn't crumble in a single day. It cracks slowly, until truth walks through the gaps. Don't click away, because in the next chapter, the cracks in James Laurel's pride become an open wound he can no longer hide. Stay, or you'll miss the moment humility finally takes center stage, where the weight of guilt meets the power of grace, and the maid who stood tall becomes the mirror the billionaire can't ignore. The next morning dawned softer than usual. The sun rose slowly over the Azure Palace Hotel, casting long golden beams across the marble lobby. But for James Laurel, the beauty of it all felt hollow. Sleep had evaded him. Every time he closed his eyes, her words returned like a haunting melody. La verdadera pobreza no es no tener dinero, es no tener respeto. True poverty isn't the lack of money, Mr. Laurel. It's the lack of respect. They played again and again, until his pride began to sound like noise. He had spent a lifetime buying silence. Now he found himself craving honesty, even if it cut him open. By mid-morning, the hotel bustled with quiet efficiency. Guests glided through the lobby with luggage and latte cups, unaware that the man walking among them, impeccably dressed, calm, composed, was carrying a storm inside. James walked toward the penthouse hallway, hands clasped behind his back, as if trying to look busy enough to disguise his hesitation. He had asked the front desk discreetly if the maid from his suite was on duty. They told him yes, Ms. Jennings, assigned again to the 17th floor. When he saw her, she was kneeling by a window, polishing the brass handles with her usual precision. The morning light caught the side of her face. Calm, focused, peaceful. He froze. For a moment, he thought about walking away. Billionaires weren't supposed to apologize. They bought apologies. But the thought of walking away from her felt cowardly. He cleared his throat softly. Ms. Jennings? Patricia turned, startled. For a brief second, her composure faltered, but she quickly straightened up. Good morning, sir. Do you need the suite serviced again? He shook his head. His voice came out lower than usual. No, I wanted to speak to you. She hesitated. The tone was different. Gone was the arrogance. In its place stood something uncertain. Of course, sir, she said carefully. He took a breath, his hands tightening at his sides. About yesterday. I owe you an apology. Her brows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. She simply waited, steady, silent, the way truth often waits. What I said, he continued, his voice strained, was ignorant, cruel. I spoke from pride, not from character. Patricia looked at him, not with anger, but with the quiet patience of someone who's seen regret before and knows how to recognize sincerity when it finally appears. I understand, sir, she said softly, but her tone wasn't forgiving just yet. It was cautious, testing whether this moment was real or just polite guilt. He nodded, lowering his gaze briefly. I spent years believing power excused my tone. Yesterday proved me wrong. You spoke to me in a language I thought I owned, and reminded me I had forgotten how to listen. Her eyes softened. It's not the language that matters, sir. It's the heart behind it. Then you have more of it than most people I know, he said quietly. The silence that followed was different from yesterday's. Not heavy, not cold. It was the kind of silence that felt like a beginning. A few minutes later, she resumed her work, quietly folding towels, aligning bottles, doing what she always did. But the air between them was no longer sharp. It was healing. James lingered for a moment longer, uncertain of what else to say. Then, as he turned to leave, he paused and looked back. "Ms. Jennings." She looked up. "For what it's worth, I meant what I said. I'm trying to be better." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "That's all any of us can do, Mr. Laurel." He nodded once and walked away, his reflection trailing him across the glossy marble floor. A man no longer running from the truth, but trying to walk in step with it. That afternoon, the staff whispered quietly about the encounter. "Did you hear? The billionaire spoke to her again." He apologized. "Apologized? Are you sure?" Patricia ignored the murmurs. She didn't need an audience for grace. To her, the real victory wasn't in being acknowledged. It was in watching pride bend without force. When her shift ended, she went home to her small apartment, made tea for her mother, and sat by the window. Her mother noticed the lightness in her face. "Something good happen at work today?" Patricia smiled faintly. "Maybe not good, but right." Her mother chuckled. Right has a way of becoming good if you wait long enough. The next day, the Azure Palace Hotel hummed as usual, though those who worked there could sense a tension floating just beneath the polished calm. Something unseen had shifted since the billionaire's quiet apology to the maid. For James Laurel, the morning began early and without rest. He sat in the corner of the hotel's executive lounge, staring into a cup of untouched coffee as sunlight spilled across the table. His board of directors was gathering for a high-level discussion about the hotel's acquisition, but his thoughts were far from business. He had spent decades speaking to rooms like this, rooms filled with suits, deals, and the illusion of control. But today, words felt heavy. Today, he wanted to mean something. When the last director entered, the meeting began in the usual rhythm. Financials, forecasts, upcoming expansions. The men laughed, joked, filled the air with the easy arrogance that comes with security. James wasn't listening. He was watching the hotel staff glide quietly in and out of the room, refilling cups, carrying trays, clearing plates. Silent ghosts moving around men who never looked up. He saw himself in their indifference, and it unsettled him. Adrian, his longest-serving associate, nudged him. "James, you all right? You've been quiet since yesterday." He didn't answer immediately. He stared at the steaming cup before him, the swirl of cream fading into dark. "I was wrong, Adrian," he said at last. The laughter at the table halted. "About what?" Adrian asked. James looked around the table, his voice low but clear. "About what respect means." The other men exchanged uneasy glances. James rarely spoke about morality, only results. "Yesterday," he continued, "I disrespected someone, a member of our staff. I said things that should never have been said, and she—" He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "She reminded me that wealth without character isn't power, it's just noise." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Adrian chuckled awkwardly, trying to break the tension. "Come on, James. We've all said worse things. You don't owe an apology to a maid." But James didn't laugh. He turned his head slowly, his eyes steady. "You're wrong. I owe her more than an apology. I owe her respect." The words hit the room like thunder, quiet, powerful. undeniable. "Gentlemen," he said, rising from his chair, "you've all worked with me long enough to know I don't waste words. Today, I intend to use them properly." He stepped out of the meeting room and motioned for his assistant. "Get me the floor manager, and ask them to send for Ms. Patricia Jennings." The assistant blinked. "Sir, the maid?" "Yes," he said firmly. "The maid." Within minutes, whispers began spreading through the hotel like wildfire. The billionaire had asked for the maid again, in front of the board, no less. Patricia was polishing the brass elevator doors when the manager approached her nervously. "Ms. Jennings, Mr. Laurel has requested your presence in the executive lounge." Her heart skipped. Not again, she thought. Had she done something wrong this time? Still, she straightened her uniform, smoothed her apron, and walked toward the lounge with her usual calm. When she entered, the room went silent. The directors looked uncomfortable, fidgeting in their chairs. James stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the back of his chair. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice that carried quiet authority, James said, "Gentlemen, this is Ms. Patricia Jennings." Her name sounded strange in that space. Strange because it had never been spoken there before. He continued, "Yesterday I disrespected this woman. I mocked her language, her hands, her work, all while she was doing the job that keeps this hotel running. I was arrogant, I was cruel, and I was wrong." Adrian shifted uneasily. The others stared, unsure how to react. "In front of all of you," James said, turning toward Patricia, "I want to apologize, not out of guilt, but because you deserve it. You reminded me that respect doesn't come from wealth, but from how we treat those who serve when no one's watching." Patricia blinked, completely still. She hadn't expected this. Not here, not in front of them. "Thank you, sir," she said softly after a pause. "Apology accepted." James nodded, relief visible in the subtle drop of his shoulders. But he wasn't finished. He turned back to the table. "From this moment forward, Laurel Holdings will establish a program for staff education and recognition across all our hotels, starting here at the Azure Palace." A murmur of disbelief ran through the board. "You can put it on record," James said firmly. "Call it the Laurel Humanity Initiative." He looked at Patricia again. "You'll be the first to benefit from it. It's not charity. It's what should have existed all along." Patricia's breath caught. Around the table, no one dared to speak. "You reminded me, Ms. Jennings," James finished quietly, "that humility isn't beneath success. It defines it." He extended his hand. Patricia hesitated, then took it. Her touch was firm, steady, dignified. In that moment, every person in that room knew they were witnessing something rare. Not the fall of a billionaire, but the rise of a man rediscovering his soul. When Patricia left the lounge, the hallway felt brighter, lighter. She didn't smile, but her eyes glimmered with quiet victory. That evening, as she clocked out, one of the receptionists whispered, "Did he really apologize to you? In front of everyone?" Patricia nodded softly. "Yes. But it wasn't about me. It was about remembering what respect sounds like." Have you ever seen someone powerful use their strength not to dominate, but to make things right? Because when pride finally bends, everything around it begins to heal. Don't click away yet. The next chapter shows how this apology becomes more than words. It becomes legacy. Stay with me, because Patricia's courage is about to echo far beyond this hotel. The day after the public apology felt strangely still. The morning bustle at the Azure Palace Hotel continued as usual. The sound of luggage wheels across marble, the clinking of china, the faint hum of jazz from the lobby speakers. But beneath that familiar rhythm, something in the air had changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It was quiet, like the moment after thunder, when the world catches its breath. For Patricia Jennings, that silence carried weight. When she arrived for her shift, people she had worked with for years looked at her differently. Not with pity, not even curiosity, but with something that resembled pride. The receptionist who used to barely meet her eyes smiled first. "Morning, Patricia." The bellboy nodded respectfully. The chef from the restaurant even stepped out of the kitchen to say, "You were brave, Nina. That took guts." Patricia smiled politely, though her heart was still catching up with what had happened. The day before, a billionaire, the man who owned the very building she scrubbed clean, had stood before his peers and apologized. Not privately, not quietly, but publicly, with sincerity that no one could deny. It was the kind of thing no one expected to witness. And yet, it had happened. In the staff lounge that morning, whispers floated through the air like secret confessions. Did you hear what he said? He's starting a scholarship fund. For us, apparently. That maid, Patricia, she must have changed him somehow. She sat in the corner with her tea, pretending not to listen. It wasn't vanity that made her quiet. It was disbelief. How could a few words spoken from pain have caused all this? She had only wanted to defend her dignity. She hadn't expected to awaken a conscience. Elsewhere in the hotel, James Laurel sat alone in his suite, staring out at the skyline that had once felt like his domain. He'd expected to feel relief after the apology. Instead, he felt something deeper, a strange mix of humility and peace, as if a weight he didn't know he carried had finally slipped off his shoulders. The silence of the room pressed in on him, but this time it didn't mock him. It invited him to listen. For the first time in years, James didn't feel the need to prove anything. He remembered the look in Patricia's eyes when she'd said, "It's not the language that matters, sir. It's the heart behind it." Those words had carved themselves into his memory. He sat at his desk, pulled out a notepad, and began sketching something new. A plan that wasn't about acquisition or construction, but people. He called it the Laurel Humanity Initiative. That afternoon, Patricia was called to the manager's office. Her stomach tightened instinctively. Years of being summoned had taught her that good news rarely followed. But when she walked in, her manager smiled. "You've received this." She handed Patricia an envelope with the company letterhead. Inside, in elegant lettering, it read, "To Ms. Patricia Jennings, you are formally invited to represent the Azure Palace Hotel as the inaugural honoree of the Laurel Humanity Initiative. Your integrity, grace, and courage have inspired not just one man, but an entire company. You reminded us all that humanity should never be a luxury. With respect," James Laurel. Patricia's throat tightened. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she folded the letter carefully, holding it against her chest as if it were made of glass. That evening, she walked home beneath the golden haze of the setting sun. The city glowed with its usual noise and movement, but she felt a stillness within her. The calm that comes when you've done something right, even if it cost you comfort. Her mother sat by the window, knitting quietly when Patricia entered. "You're home late," her mother said with a knowing smile. "Busy day." "You've had a few of those lately." Patricia chuckled softly and handed her the letter. Her mother read it slowly, her old eyes shining with pride. "You see, child," she said softly, "God doesn't waste courage. He just waits for the right moment to use it." Patricia smiled, tears brimming. "I wasn't trying to change anyone." "No," her mother replied, "but truth doesn't ask permission to change hearts. It just does." That night, Patricia sat awake long after her mother fell asleep. She took out the envelope again, running her fingers across the embossed letters. She realized something then. The apology wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of something greater. Because when respect finally enters a room that's forgotten it, everything that comes after begins to heal. Have you ever done something small, only to realize later that it changed far more than you imagined? The quiet after courage isn't emptiness, it's preparation. Don't scroll past now, because what comes next proves that when humility takes root, it doesn't just change people. It changes legacies. Stay with me, or you'll miss the moment Patricia's voice becomes history. The boardroom of Laurel Holdings International was all glass, marble, and tension. From the 52nd floor, the city looked like a model of everything James Laurel had built. Glittering, precise, efficient. But that morning, as he stood at the head of the long oak table, it all felt small. He had once loved this view. Now, it reminded him of how far he had drifted from the ground. The meeting began the way they always did, with reports, figures, and chatter about profits. Adrian, his right-hand man, joked about an upcoming acquisition in Dubai. Another director praised the company's record-breaking earnings. But James wasn't listening. His gaze drifted to the people who made that wealth possible. The hotel workers, clerks, and cleaners, whose faces he now saw clearly in his mind. Patricia Jennings's words had stripped away his blindness. He remembered her standing there in her uniform, speaking with more poise and strength than anyone in that room full of billionaires ever had. "Respect doesn't need wealth, Mr. Laurel. It needs courage." The sentence echoed like a quiet drumbeat inside him. He straightened his tie and interrupted the discussion. "Gentlemen," he said evenly, "we need to talk about something that isn't on the agenda." The room fell silent. Adrian frowned. "If this is about last week's incident—" "It's not an incident," James said, cutting him off. "It's a mirror." He stood and walked to the panoramic window, staring out at the city below. "For years, we've built the most beautiful hotels in the world. But tell me, have we built anything beautiful inside them?" The directors glanced at each other uncertainly. No one spoke. "We talk about luxury, about experiences, about excellence," he continued. "But what about the people who make all that happen? The ones who clean, cook, carry, and smile through exhaustion?" Adrian crossed his arms. "James, we compensate them fairly. That's not our concern." James turned sharply, his voice rising slightly. "That's exactly the problem. We've made it not our concern." The words hung in the air, sharp but measured. "I met a woman," he said finally. "A hotel maid named Patricia Jennings. I mocked her, in Spanish. Thought she couldn't understand me." A murmur rippled across the room. "But she did," he went on. "And she replied in Spanish, perfectly, calmly, and reminded me that true poverty isn't about money. It's about lacking respect." That day I realized I'd spent my entire career building towers and forgetting the people inside them. The room was utterly silent now. "So here's what we're going to do," He pressed a button, and the screen behind him lit up with a presentation slide titled, "The Laurel Humanity Initiative." "We're launching a global program across all Laurel Holdings properties," James said. "It'll fund scholarships, language programs, and leadership opportunities for hospitality staff, maids, janitors, receptionists, cooks, anyone who's ever been overlooked." Adrian leaned forward. "That sounds expensive. Investors won't like it." James smiled faintly, for the first time in days. "Then they can invest somewhere else. We've built enough towers." "It's time we build people." A stunned pause. Then one of the younger directors, a quiet man from marketing, spoke up. "This is actually good. It's the right move. The brand could use something real again." James nodded slowly. "It's not about brand. It's about balance. I lost mine a long time ago. This," he gestured toward the screen, "is how I get it back." After the meeting, Adrian followed him out, visibly shaken. "You really mean to go through with this?" James turned, meeting his gaze evenly. "Yes. For once, I want to do something that doesn't earn me applause. Just peace." Adrian sighed. "You've changed, James." He smiled faintly. "No, I'm just remembering who I was before I forgot." That night, he sat in his office long after everyone had left. The city glittered below him, its lights flickering like restless thoughts. He opened his laptop and began to type an email addressed to Patricia. Subject: Thank you. Ms. Jennings. You reminded me that power means nothing without purpose. I can't undo my words, but I can rebuild what they broke. Tomorrow, the first announcement of the Laurel Humanity Initiative will go public, and your name will be attached to it, not mine, because you inspired it. Sincerely, James Laurel. He hit send and leaned back, exhaling deeply. For the first time in years, the silence of his office didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like grace. Across the city, Patricia's phone buzzed. She read the email twice, her eyes misting. Then she whispered, "He's really changing." She looked up toward the night sky and smiled. Sometimes redemption doesn't shout. It whispers. Have you ever seen someone use their power to lift others instead of themselves? Power doesn't make people good. Choice does. Don't scroll away, because what comes next will show how one act of humility can ripple through generations. Stay with me. Patricia's courage is about to become a legacy. The rain came softly that morning, like a benediction. It streaked the glass windows of the Azure Palace Hotel, turning the city skyline into a watercolor painting. The hum of traffic below was muffled, distant, peaceful. In her small staff room, tucked behind the linen storage, Patricia Jennings sat sipping tea from a chipped blue mug. The days had been calmer since the apology. The tension that once hung over the hotel like invisible fog had lifted. And yet, there was still something she couldn't quite name. A quiet expectancy, as if life itself was holding its breath. It came that afternoon, in the form of a cream envelope with her name written in dark blue ink. Her supervisor handed it to her with a small smile. Delivered by courier. No return address. Patricia frowned softly. The handwriting looked deliberate, almost careful, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who didn't often write letters, but took his time when he did. She sat on the edge of her cot, turned the envelope over in her hands, and broke the seal. Inside was a thick, folded page embossed with the initials J.L. She didn't need to wonder who it was from. The first line took her breath away. Dear Ms. Jennings, I have written many contracts, many speeches, and far too many press statements in my life. But never something like this. Never a letter that comes not from duty, but from debt. Not the kind that money can pay, but the kind that a soul owes when it has been woken. Patricia read on, her eyes widening with every sentence. The day I mocked you, I thought I was being clever. You were just a maid in my eyes, background noise in the orchestra of my success. But then you spoke, in my own language, fluently, flawlessly. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't hearing Spanish. I was hearing the truth. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't need to. You simply reminded me that respect isn't something earned by titles, but by character. That day, you showed me the difference between power and integrity. She stopped reading for a moment, pressing her hand over her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. I went back to my room that night and stared at my reflection. The same man the world calls brilliant. But for the first time in years, I didn't see success. I saw a child who had once watched his mother come home exhausted from cleaning offices and promised he'd never let anyone treat her like she was invisible. Somewhere along the way, I became the kind of man she used to pray I'd never become. You reminded me of her, of what I lost, of what I can still regain. The ink on the next line looked darker, as if his hand had pressed harder into the paper. I've decided to build something new. Not another tower, not another empire, but something human. The Laurel Humanity Initiative will carry your name at its foundation. It will fund the education and growth of hotel staff across all our properties. It will open doors for the people we once walked past. You'll be the first recipient, not because you need it, but because you earned it. I want the world to know who you are, Ms. Jennings. Not as a maid, but as a mirror. The one that made a powerful man see himself again. Patricia's tears fell freely now, soft and steady. She turned the page. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve friendship. But I wanted you to know, you changed me. There's a peace that comes when a person finally bows to truth, and that peace has your name on it. If I never see you again, I want to thank you for the lesson you didn't know you were teaching. You reminded me that wealth is loud, but wisdom is quiet. With respect, James Laurel. Patricia sat still for a long while, her hands trembling around the paper. The room felt too small for the weight of the words she had just read. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, as the rain outside tapped softly against the window. She thought about her father's death, her mother's illness, the years she'd spent bending without breaking, and how a single moment of courage had somehow turned all that pain into purpose. After a long pause, she reached for a pen and a small piece of hotel stationery. Her reply was short, simple, graceful. Dear Mr. Laurel, thank you for your words. I never wanted to embarrass you, only to remind you that respect should never have a price tag. I'm honored by your decision, but more than that, I'm glad you listened. Forgiveness is a language we all understand, no matter how high we rise. Sincerely, Patricia Jennings. She folded the note carefully, sealed it in a plain envelope, and left it at the front desk with his name on it. That night, miles away, James Laurel sat by his office window in New York. His assistant had just handed him an envelope marked "Private." He opened it and read her reply in silence. Then, with a slow breath and a quiet smile, he whispered to himself, "Forgiveness is a language we all understand." He leaned back, eyes glistening, and for the first time in decades, He felt something that no amount of money had ever given him: peace. Have you ever received a message that made you see yourself differently, not through shame, but through truth? Letters like this don't just change characters in stories, they change people in real life. Don't scroll away, because what comes next shows how one letter, born from humility, can ripple across generations. Stay with me, or you'll miss how Patricia's courage becomes the spark for countless others. The morning air in the Azure Palace Hotel carried something it had never had before: anticipation. The same walls that had once echoed with quiet hierarchy now hummed with hope. For the first time in years, the staff walked with their heads a little higher, their smiles a little wider. And at the center of it all stood Patricia Jennings, the woman whose courage had turned a moment of humiliation into a movement of humanity. A week after receiving the letter, Patricia was invited to the ballroom for a special ceremony. The very same room where billionaires once celebrated contracts now glowed with soft lights, elegant music, and faces from every corner of the hotel. Chefs in white uniforms stood beside receptionists in navy. Housekeepers stood shoulder to shoulder with executives. For once, there were no ranks, just people. When Patricia entered, the applause began almost immediately. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was sincere. She could feel her heartbeat echoing in her chest as she walked toward the stage. At the front of the room, James Laurel waited, not in a suit of superiority, but in one of humility. His tie was simple, his posture less rigid, his expression almost peaceful. He smiled when their eyes met. Not the charming smile of a billionaire used to being admired, but the kind that said thank you without words. The MC cleared his throat, his voice echoing softly through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, today we celebrate not just excellence in hospitality, but the humanity that defines it. The Laurel Humanity Initiative is more than a program. It's a promise that every act of service deserves dignity and every worker deserves opportunity. He gestured toward Patricia. And it all began with one woman's courage. The applause returned, stronger this time. Patricia walked onto the stage slowly, her black dress modest yet graceful. The moment felt surreal. She had walked these halls as a maid for years, always invisible, always in the background. But now, every light in the room seemed to find her. James stepped forward and handed her a folder embossed with gold. The Laurel Humanity Scholarship, awarded to Patricia Jennings. As she took it, he said softly enough for only her to hear, "This is just paper, Ms. Jennings. You're the story that gives it meaning." Her eyes glistened. "Thank you, Mr. Laurel." "No," he said quietly. "Thank you. You reminded me that success without compassion is just noise." When she turned to face the crowd, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice didn't. "I never thought I'd stand here," she began. "A year ago, I was just a maid trying to make ends meet. I didn't plan to speak up that day, but something inside me wouldn't stay silent. Not out of anger, but out of truth." The room was silent, every face focused. When someone mocks your worth, it's easy to believe them. But dignity isn't something anyone can give or take. It's something you carry, quietly, every day, in how you choose to respond. She glanced toward James. And sometimes, even the proud can listen. A soft ripple of emotion spread across the audience. "If this story teaches anything," she continued, "let it be that kindness is strength and respect is the highest form of power, because the way we treat those beneath us says more about us than our titles ever could." When she finished, the applause rose like a wave. Not forced, but genuine, heartfelt. Even the executives who had once ignored her were on their feet. After the ceremony, James approached her once more as the staff surrounded her with congratulations. "You spoke beautifully," he said with quiet pride. Patricia smiled. "You listened beautifully." He chuckled softly. "You're going to do great things, Ms. Jennings." "I already did, Mr. Laurel," she replied gently. "I spoke my truth. The rest is grace." That evening, she sat at her small desk at home, the scholarship certificate beside her, her mother dozing peacefully in the next room. As she opened her old notebook, the one where she had once practiced Spanish phrases years ago, and wrote a single line at the top of a new page. "Courage is not loud. It's the quiet voice that says, 'Try again tomorrow.'" She smiled to herself, closing the book gently. Life had not suddenly become perfect, but it had become possible. Meanwhile, in a glass office across the city, James Laurel sat alone, the lights of New York painting streaks of gold across his desk. On the wall behind him hung a framed photo, the one taken at the ceremony earlier that day. He wasn't at the center of it. Patricia was. He studied the photo for a long moment, then whispered, "You were right, Ms. Jennings. True poverty is the lack of respect, and wealth is learning to listen." He turned off the light and walked away, leaving the city to glow quietly behind him. The auditorium was vast, its walls lined with golden light and whispers. The banners read, "Global Forum on Human Leadership and Integrity, Madrid." Hundreds of faces filled the seats, CEOs, scholars, entrepreneurs, and workers from across the world. The room hummed with anticipation as the moderator announced the final keynote speaker of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing warmly through the hall, "please welcome Ms. Patricia Jennings, recipient of the Laurel Humanity Award, and the woman whose story has inspired thousands across the hospitality industry." The applause swelled like a rising tide. From the wings, Patricia Jennings, now 32, stepped onto the stage with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that true power never needs to shout. She wore a soft cream suit, simple, elegant, and around her neck hung a small silver pendant her mother had given her the day she left Ghana for Spain. Her hair framed her face beautifully, her eyes glowing with gratitude and grace. As she reached the podium, the applause softened to silence. Patricia looked out over the sea of faces and smiled. "A few years ago," she began, "I was a hotel maid who thought her story didn't matter. I cleaned rooms, folded sheets, and tried to stay invisible. I didn't realize that sometimes invisibility is what teaches you to see." A murmur of quiet agreement rippled through the room. "One afternoon, a man mocked me," she continued, her tone steady, gentle. "He used a language he thought I couldn't understand, but I did. And I replied, not to embarrass him, but to remind him that respect isn't a luxury reserved for the powerful. It's the foundation of humanity." Her voice grew softer, but stronger. "That conversation changed my life. Not because I won an argument, but because it taught me this truth. When you speak with dignity, even arrogance has to listen." The audience was motionless now, hanging on every word. "That man," she said, pausing for a moment, "was named James Laurel, and he didn't stay the man who mocked me. He became the man who changed the system that allowed such arrogance to exist." The hall remained silent, the kind of silence that hums with awe. "He reminded me," Patricia said, smiling faintly, "that even those who fall the hardest can rise again, if they are willing to listen." At the back of the auditorium, an older man sat quietly in the shadows.
"You've come to the end
His
of
hair
this
had
love
thinned,
story.
his face
But
lined
another
with time,
billionaire's secret
but
is
his
brewing.
eyes still held the same
next tale will
depth
be
that had
more
once seen
seductive,
cities from
more
glass
forbidden,
towers.
and far more addictive.
James Laurel
So
didn't
do
want
check
the
it out.
spotlight.
Click on the
He had
image
flown
showing on
in
your screen
quietly,
right now
without
to watch
fanfare,
the next one.
just to
Until
listen.
then, guard your heart.
When he saw
because
Patricia
the Powder
standing
Room
there,
Tales is only getting
radiant,
started.
articulate, at peace, something in his heart whispered, "This is what redemption looks like." Patricia continued, her hands resting lightly on the podium. The Laurel Humanity Initiative now supports over 2,000 hotel workers around the world. Cooks have become managers. Janitors have become engineers. Maids have become business owners. And every one of them carries the same message, that kindness is not weakness, it's strength, wrapped in humility. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "So today, I don't just speak as a former maid. I speak as proof that a single moment of courage can outlive shame, pride, and time itself." The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. For a moment, Patricia stood there, overwhelmed by the sight. People of every color, language, and background applauding a story that began in a hotel hallway. She smiled, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "May we all choose respect, even when it's hard." After the event, Patricia stepped outside into the cool Madrid evening. The city buzzed with life, laughter from cafes, soft music drifting from the plaza, and the gentle hum of a place that never really slept. She exhaled deeply, the kind of sigh that comes not from exhaustion, but fulfillment. That's when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "You always had a way with words," she turned. And there he was. James Laurel, older now, leaning on a cane, smiling faintly. "Mr. Laurel," she said warmly. "You came." He nodded. "Wouldn't have missed it for the world." For a moment, neither spoke. They just stood there, two people from entirely different worlds, bound by one story. "You were right that day," he said softly. "Respect isn't earned by wealth. It's given by choice." Patricia smiled gently. "And forgiveness isn't something we wait for, Mr. Laurel. It's something we give, because the world doesn't heal without it." He chuckled, his eyes glistening. "I suppose you've forgiven me, then?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "I forgave you the moment I saw you change." He nodded slowly, deeply moved. "You turned my arrogance into purpose, Patricia. Thank you." She looked up at him with quiet grace. "No, Mr. Laurel, we turned pain into purpose. It takes two, one to speak and one to listen." The two of them stood under the Madrid night sky, stars glittering above. Not maid and billionaire, not guilt and grace, just two souls who had learned the language of humanity. As James turned to leave, Patricia called after him softly. "Mr. Laurel?" He looked back. "You once said that respect needs courage. You were right. But courage also needs memory. Don't ever forget who you used to be, or who you became after." He smiled, a real, humble smile, and whispered, "I won't." Then he walked away slowly into the night. Patricia stood there for a long moment, her heart full. She looked up at the stars and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. for second chances, for redemption, for the power of one voice. What if your voice, the one you're afraid to use, could be the reason someone else remembers their humanity? Too many people keep quiet when their courage could change someone's life. Don't be one of them. Subscribe to Powder Room Tales before you leave, because stories like Patricia's remind us that words can heal, humility can rebuild, and even the proudest hearts can learn to listen. Years later, in the lobby of the Azure Palace Hotel, a small brass plaque was mounted near the entrance. It read, "In honor of Patricia Jennings, whose words taught us that respect is the true measure of wealth." Guests walked by it every day, some pausing, some smiling, never realizing that the woman who inspired it once walked the same halls with a cleaning cart and a quiet dream. And somewhere, in an old leather office in New York, an aging billionaire kept a framed letter on his desk, signed in careful handwriting, "With respect, Patricia Jennings," because some echoes never fade. They become legacies.